Hotep family, it's just hey Tep back at you again with Giza Studios. This is a clip from the Grandmaster Teacher, Dr.John Clarke. And yeah.
Enslaved in the Europeans, he just assumed automatically no European would enslave him. He had never dealt with anyone who would enslave the host and the wife who cooked the meal and lie about it. Around 1442, the first slaves would be taken out of West Africa. Spain and Portugal goes to the Pope, the leading arbitrator of that day, the one person in Europe with the greatest authority. The Pope would say to Spain and Portugal, you take the East and you take the West, and you two good Catholic nations start fighting among yourselves. And then the profound statement before departure, you are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. The slave trade now had been sanctioned. The Europeans had been told they need not feel guilty of it because you're doing this to an infidel who is outside of God's grace. England went into the slave trade with a vengeance, led by Captain Hawkins and the good ship Jesus. The ship was called the good ship Jesus. The coat of arms on the ship was two Africans bound back to back with their arms tied. So they saw no contradiction in being in the slave trade and being Christians at the same time. We cannot deal with this enough because we're still suffering from this inside of the mind of a lot of people in this world, into the millions. We are outside of humanity, outside of the grace of God. That's a terrible feeling as you walk the earth, because what has been taken away is your essential humanity, your human beingness. And when they take away your human beingness, they take away your nationness. Early in the 19th century, the concept of slavery began to yield to the concept of colonialism, a more sophisticated form of slavery. Slavery as a system became unwieldy, and besides, the point where it was saturated, everybody who wanted a slave had one, who could afford one. The European nations of size that did not have any portion of Africa began to grumble. At the Berlin Conference, 1884 and 1885, the European powers of substance who did not have any part of Africa now were given some part.
Africans did not fall at the feet of the European invaders. They fought fiercely, bravely, and continually.
Anti-colonial wars started up down the coast of West Africa and parts of Inner Africa and in the Congo. There was armed resistance. The Zulu wars lasted from the 1650s when the Boers arrived to the last Zulu war was 1906. In Ghana, the Ashanti wars lasted from early in the 18th century to the last Ashanti war led by a woman, Ye Asantewa, in 1900. For a while, it looked as though the Europeans would not be able to hold on to the continent. More manpower and more ruthless treatment brought it mainly under their control. By 1884, 1885, and afterward, there wasn't no dispute about who was in charge of Africa, just who was in charge of what part of it. We have been hung up with a myth, the myth of the conqueror and the invader as the bringer of civilization. No people ever brought civilization to another people at no time and at no place in history. It's one of the most protracted lies we ever listened to. Civilization is the art of being civil. The word civil means being peaceful.
Talk to him, Clarke.
There's nothing peaceful about aggression.
Right.
Only the slave can abolish slavery. If someone is on your back, you have to bend a little to balance them on your back. Now, the best move if you want to get them off of your back is to stand straight up.
Real talk.
There's something about an island or a body of water that creates a special kind of dreamer, because they did not know where they came from in Africa. They dreamed of the whole of it, bring it all together in one piece.
The seeds of Pan-Africanism, planted in the United States during slavery years, later flourish in the fertile soil of the British West Indies.
Trinidad produced the three greatest Pan-Africanists, H. Sylvester Williams, C.L.R. James, and George Padmore. In Trinidad, they found the Pan-African League. H. Sylvester Williams would eventually call it Pan-African. He would call a conference in London in 1900. A few scattered Africans, a few people from the Caribbean, W. Du Bois from the United States. They did not ask for the independence of African states then. They asked for preparation. Give us the kind of education that will prepare us for eventual independence. They were reasonable, but they weren't listened to. And yet the conference made some kind of impression. After the first Congress, Du Bois would be the leading light from the second through fourth, but the most meaningful, the one that Du Bois called in Paris. As a result of this Congress, Du Bois came to center stage as the leader and theoretician of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism wasn't exactly new because Black Americans were practicing it long before someone gave it a name. The African settlement movement, the movement that settled Liberia, was in form of Pan-African movement. The so-called Negro Convention movement was most a discussion of how you bring the African world together. That whole 19th century was Pan-African thought. Prince Hall, his development of the Black Masonic order that he called the African Lodge. The search for a place in Africa for settlement by Martin Delany and Robert Campbell. 1829, David Walker's appeal to the colored people of the world was basically a Pan-African appeal. All of this, before we come down to the end of the 19th century. The ultimate Pan-Africanist, of course, was the Jamaican Marcus Garvey.
Citizens of Africa, I greet you in the name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. You may ask, what organization is that? It is for me to inform you that the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that seeks to unite into one solid body the 400 million Negroes of the world.
It was soon after the end of World War I, the Secretary of War had told the Black American soldiers that their lot would not be appreciably changed by virtue of the fact that they fought in the war. There had been an investigation. It was discovered that many of the nurses wouldn't treat black soldiers in the hospital, wouldn't even touch them. some of them died as a result. So you have these grievances pent up in the veteran coming home. All of this came to a head in 1919 when there were riots all over the United States. That's called the Red Summer. Marcus Garvey could point out, look, they don't want you here. Let's go back home. Let's go back to Africa. Let's not only go back to Africa, let's go back in our own ships. Now, a whole lot of people who otherwise would not listen, now willing to listen.
We hear the cry of France for the Frenchmen, of Germany for the Germans, of Ireland for the Irish, of Japan for the Japanese. We of the Universal Negro Movement Association are raising the cry of Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad.
He began to dream the great dream and rescue the mind of millions of black Americans from depression and self-doubt. By 1923, he was in some difficulty with the boats and some of the people he had hired to run the boats. Terrible mismanagement and betrayal. He collected millions of dollars from black Americans to buy these boats, and these boats were old and not as seaworthy as he thought they were. Garvey moved over large territory, maybe too fast, and yet he built the largest movement in black America before or since. There needs to be a reassessment of Marcus Garvey and his long-reaching effects. He called attention to what slavery and colonialism had taken away. They took away a concept essential to all the people in the world. They took away the concept of state management and state maintenance. Once you are taken from the geography of your origin and forced to live in a state designed by others, you're still the slave to the man who's astute enough to control a container called the state.
The cannons of World War II were barely cold when Africans met in Manchester, England. They were prepared to claim that container called the state for themselves.
The Pan-African Congress of 1945, now you have the one thing you did not have in the rest of them. You have Caribbean scholars, African-American scholars, not a whole lot, and Africans themselves are now participating. We're not talking about Africa out of the presence of Africa. Now you're talking about Africans with the Africans on the scene. One African being the co-convener of the conference, Kwame Nkrumah. Out of that fifth Pan-African Congress came the mentality, the basic planning to rule and to take over a nation. The others were saying, give us the education. At the fifth Pan-African Congress, they said, we got the education, we got the manpower, we want to rule now.
The people of Ghana resisted British rule from the very beginning.
Right.
In March of 1957, they become the first Africans to win their freedom. Kwame Nkrumah was ready to rule.
When I knew Nkrumah in the Harlem History Club days, my impression of him was not as the future head of state, but as an African who's going to go back and make a major contribution to his nation. And he was a committed African. I went to Africa in 1958 because I've been promising myself I was going to get to Africa next year. That promise of myself went on for about 5 years before I actually got there. When I got there, all I had was a return ticket. I told an African who had read one of my stories in an African magazine and wrote and got my address. I said I was coming to Ghana, get me a place in a hotel for a few days, and he didn't even go to a hotel, he didn't even try. He took me to the slums of Accra, and I lived right there with him. Finally, a check that was due me from America did not arrive. When it did arrive, it bounced. there I was, and one day, Nkrumah had gone someplace. He's coming home from a visit of state. A whole lot of people along the highway hailing his return, and so I was along with the rest of them. I was just like another African melted into the crowd. And he spotted me, and they stopped the Rolls Royce, and the motorcycle drivers pulled out guns, thought that someone was about to hurt the president, you know. his motorcade stopped, and he came out and he said, "What the hell are you doing in my country?" And I just laughed. He said, "You're a long way from Harlem." He looked right and said, "Where do you live?" I said, in Jamestown. Jamestown is the slums of Accra. Still is. He shook his head and said, "You sure must love Africa." Finally, he headed back to his car, and he turned back to me. He said, "You know what I'm going to do for you?" I told him I didn't have any job, and my check had bounced. I didn't even know how I was going to get home. "I'm going to put your Harlem behind to work." And he gave me a job. Working on his newspaper, the Evening News. The significance of Ghana's independence at that time is that it gave spirit to the whole of the African world. It was a major impact on Black America because it came at the time the Civil Rights Movement was reaching a crescendo, a great height. His first vision of Pan-Africanism was physical unification of Africa. He said that Ghanaian freedom won't mean anything until the rest of Africa is free. So the spirit of Ghanaian independence would create a light of hope in the rest of Africa. And this is what Kwame Nkrumah was trying to build. This is what the intelligence services of the United States, England, and France had to destroy to keep the example of Ghana from emerging. What went wrong was our misunderstanding of what a state consists of and the responsibility that goes into holding one together. And our dependence on our colonial masters more than we anticipated. We who had longed so much for power, we wanted power. When we got close enough to touch it, we realized we hadn't even decided what we're going to do with it once we get it.
I want to take this opportunity to welcome again to the United States, which he knows so well, the first citizen of Ghana, President Nkrumah.
I was in the anti-poverty program in Harlem, and when Nkrumah came and spoke at the United Nations, I got the picture and showed it to them, and I got the speech. And the first thing I showed them, I said, "Look, there's a black man, head of a nation, speaking to the world. He got coarse, nappy hair. He didn't apologize for it. Right. Here I am.
Real talk.
African and black and bold and powerful
black.
And head of a nation. And I got something to say to you, and this is what I got to say."
Real talk, man.
Real mother talk. Black power. Black power. Black power. Black power. Black power. Black power.
The passive resistance of Gandhi, and we should understand this, was a strategy.
I regard myself as a soldier, so a soldier of peace.
I received the inspiration to carry on in the nonviolent tradition from Jesus of Nazareth and the operational technique from Mahatma Gandhi.
The passive resistance of the civil rights movement was sold as a way of life. A strategy is never a way of life. A strategy is something you use the same as you use an orange. When the juice is gone, you throw it in the garbage can. And Mahatma Gandhi was an East Indian nationalist, but a very skillful politician. And he always had a violent alternative waiting in the wing just in case his nonviolence didn't work.
Trying to act like he was peaceful.
Today marks the
It's
beginning
about violence too, man.
of a determined, organized, mobilized
Him as
campaign
well.
to get the right to vote all over this state.
I think Dr. Martin Luther King was the spiritual leader of the black movement, of the civil rights movement, and probably one of the finest theologians that we produced in recent years. He was a dreamer, and yet he was a committed man to struggle, and he made great sacrifice within that struggle. I had some strong disagreements with him. I never thought that we should be locked into the concept of nonviolence as a way of life. I was perfectly willing to use it as a strategy. I think we should be slow in criticizing Martin Luther King. He was brave enough to put his life on the line for what he believed. We are still here talking. That's proof enough of his bravery over ours. I think the March on Washington was
March didn't do
just
shit
that.
for us.
It wasn't a march on Washington, it was a march
March on
in
Washington, Million Man
I
March
don't
ain't doing
know
shit
of
for
any
us.
sweeping achievements that came out of it. It was a great ceremony. I'd be hard-pressed to identify the substance. I happen to think we've gotten enough mileage out of marching. It was a great ceremony. It was a great rehearsal for a show we did not put on the road.
Right.
For a time, we had the attention of the world. Between the Civil Rights Movement, the Caribbean Federation Movement, and the African Independence Movement, we had the attention of the world, and there were people, though they hated our guts, they were willing to make concessions to us based on the fact that we were ready to handle power. We made too many speeches and didn't do the necessary work, the unglamorous off-camera work that would have made it possible. That was our great mistake. Ceremony that lacked substance. And that was a voice, loud and clear, and analytical.
You already know who he talking about.
We were fighting to keep from hearing that voice. It was the voice of Big Bad Malcolm X, who had both the national and the international message.
One of the reasons that it is bad for us to continue to just refer to ourselves as so-called Negro, that's negative. When we say so-called Negro, that's pointing out what we aren't, but it isn't telling us what we are.
Real talk.
We are African, and we happen to be in America. We're not Americans. We are people who formerly were Africans who were kidnapped and brought to America.
I met him first in 1958. I know him from that period until his death, and sometimes saw him on a daily basis. I would furnish information on history and background information. I never told Malcolm X what to do, and I don't remember anybody else who told him what to do either.
They have studied the tactics and the strategy and the methods of all of the African nations who have emerged and won their independence. And they've seen that the Africans didn't get it by sitting in. They didn't get it by waiting in. They didn't get it by singing "We Shall Overcome." They got it through nationalism.
I first met Malcolm at the World's Trade Show building. Looked me up and down and said, "I bet you're a swine eater." I'll admit that I had paid some joyful visits to pork chops and other parts of the pig. And I said that, you know, Malcolm, if it wasn't for the pig, you and I wouldn't be here arguing about the pig, because some of us would be gone. We would have starved to death. Many times when Malcolm X was prefacing his speeches with the
Real talk.
words the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, Malcolm X was teaching Malcolm X lessons over and beyond anything the Honorable Elijah Muhammad ever thought about.
Real
You
talk.
say we are on the road now to a better world because the white man promised integration. This is a disgrace.
Mr. Muhammad's analysis is that until the image of the black man in the mind of the black man has been changed, you will always have delinquency, parental as well as juvenile. So his entire approach is not so much to change the attitude of the white man toward the black man, but to change the attitude of the black man about himself.
The Arabs and certain powerful groups within Islam really wanted Malcolm on their side. There was a serious attempt to persuade Malcolm to turn on Elijah Muhammad and establish a second Islamic group based on what they considered to be Orthodox Islam. They offered him $3.5 million. He turned it down, and we were walking down the street toward his car, and this man had turned down $3.5 million and whacked me on the shoulder and says, "Swine eater, let me buy you a cup of coffee." He was more loyal to Elijah Muhammad than Elijah Muhammad eventually was to him. Elijah Muhammad was getting old and feeble, and there was suspicion that Malcolm X would be the logical successor. There were those within the nation who didn't want Malcolm X as the logical successor because Malcolm X would have done some serious house cleaning. He was an honest man, and there were some thieves in the house. I think his development as a Pan-Africanist came a little later in his life. In the final analysis, he was as good a Pan-Africanist as any of the rest.
We have to have the type of understanding of Africa and the type of understanding of our people here in order to build a bridge, a contact, a line of communication between the two. And once the lines of communication have been established, and our African brothers can stretch forth their hands and reach us, and we can stretch forth our hands and reach them, why, there's nothing that this blue-eyed man in this country will be able to do to you and me successfully from that day onward.
Malcolm X had laid down a threat to the colonial powers of the world.
It is nationalism that's bringing freedom to oppressed